Mhm. Sitting here noticing my collar is all askew, but that's kind of normal. I am a little bit out of whack most of the time anyway. So uh, today we're going to look at 1 Samuel 11 through 14. And on Saturday, as we ended looking at chapter 10, Saul was appointed king, anointed king. Uh, God had chosen him, and on the day, then everybody's gathered, and well, where is this guy? And of course, he was hiding, and I can understand that, hiding, and he hadn't sought this king position, but God had chosen him for it, and I've heard many times, God doesn't uh, call those who are equipped; He equips those whom He calls. And Saul didn't have any training. He didn't have the knowledge to be this king or anything, and so he needed to trust and rely on God. And in some ways he did, and in some ways he didn't. And we'll read a little bit about that today. But so he had just been anointed king, and as some of them were cheering at the end of chapter 10, long live the king. It says that there were some rebels that said, how can this man help us? So they despised him. But Saul didn't seek revenge against him. He didn't, do anything about it. He just, this is going to be all right. And then it says, verse of chapter 11, the Nahash and the Ammonite came up against the men and said, make a covenant with us and we will serve you. And the condition is, well, make a covenant and I'll put out all your right eyes. I mean, what? What kind of a covenant is that? That's not treating people very rightly or anything. And just one more of those things that just doesn't make sense. But it says you hold off for 7 days that we can send a messenger and get all this figured out. And fear of the Lord falls upon the people, in verse 7 there. And they come out with the children, with the number of the children of Israel, the soldiers, the men were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. So they had quite a few people. There's no question about that. And Saul divided them into companies for the battle, but they're going, to battle for Israel, for their land, and for the sake of all that way. And Samuel addresses the people in chapter 12 as Saul is made the king. And Samuel has told the people that when you have a king, he's going to conscript your for soldiers and for money and for all of this and that and everything. And then he comes with these questions. Here I am, witness before me today. What have I taken from you? What have I demanded from you? If I taken an army, if I taken this or that, he says, whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey? Who have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? And from whom have I received a bribe? Anything you can find against me, I will restore. And they all replied that, Samuel, you have led and fairly and honestly. You haven't cheated. You haven't taken advantage. You have been God's leader, God's guide, and the voice of God for us. And they said that with God as our witness, basically, they have not, you have not taken advantage of us. And then Samuel has another longer speech reminding the people again of how, the Lord led them out of Egypt and gave them all of these different leaders, and all the people came against you, but God was for you. And in verse 12, he says, you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you. You said, no, when a king will reign over us, when the Lord God was your king. Reminding them, that God had been leading and guiding them just as this earthly king, that God was active in their lives and in their country and in their people. And when they followed him, things were good. And that's the same as, life on earth this way. If you follow the laws of the land and you do what the law of the land requires, it's all good. But if you start revolting against the law of the land, against, say, let's just say the king or the Lord, things probably aren't going to go so well. You'll find yourself in trouble that way. And Samuel says to them in verse 20, do not fear. You have done all this wickedness, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Don't go after things that won't profit you or help you. The Lord will not forsake you. And so Samuel just continues to remind them to follow God and to do what it is that God would have them do. Chapter 13 begins with Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years, he chose 3,000 men to go, and they were going to attack these other people, Saul and these men. And so Saul took, it says, 3,000 men of Israel with him, and 2,000 were with him, and 1,000 of them were with Jonathan. And Jonathan is Saul's son, who was, kind of second in command of army and all of those different things. And Jonathan attacked this garrison, and Saul blew the trumpet, and they had some success against the Philistines. But then verse 5, the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots with 6,000 horsemen. People got it as thick as the sand on the seashore, just tremendous number of people. And so the Israelites, began to fear. They could see that they're outnumbered, and they begin to hide in the hills and in the caves and any place and everything they can. They're maybe trying to set up ambushes, but they're looking out for their safety because of all of these people. And they're waiting somewhat for Samuel to come. It's kind of hard to read through the lines and hear everything, but it said, verse 7, the middle of that, Saul was waiting at Gilgal, and he waited for 7 days according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come. So Saul set up an altar and provided a burnt offering. And just after that, then Samuel comes and says, what have you done? You didn't wait for me like you're supposed to. You took it upon yourself to offer the burnt offering when that's not your position, that's not your right, you shouldn't be doing that. And Samuel says to Saul in verse 13, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord, which he commanded you. And now he says your kingdom will not continue. Although, Saul continued to be king for many years, but it wasn't what God would have had. Saul had forsaken the leadership of God that way. And as I read this from verse 16 to the end of chapter 13, Saul and his son Jonathan were all there. The Philistines were camped out, and raiders came. But verse 19, there was no blacksmith found in Israel. So for the Israelites, if they needed a plowshare done or they needed a knife sharpened or needed something, they had to go to the Philistines. So none of the Israelites, with the exception of Saul and Jonathan, had a sword, had a knife, had a weapon. And how are they going to go to battle that way? It just, and I'm thinking, how can it even be? But it's the reality that they didn't have the weapons, and when they would go to battle, when God was leading and guiding, God took care of what needed to happen. And in chapter 14, there's some battle doing here. Jonathan takes it upon himself to take his armor bearer, and they go up against this outpost, and they battle, and they are successful in their battle. And in this chapter also, Saul makes a command that until nightfall, none of the men should eat anything. Well, Jonathan doesn't know about that, And as they're walking through these trees, the honey is there. So Jonathan dips his staff into the honey and eats some of the honey. And of course, then, this is against what the king had ordered. And so, verse 43, Jonathan said, I only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, so now I must die. And, what the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan, who has accomplished this great deliverance? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. So they spoke up for the good that he did, and there was salvation for Jonathan. It's so hard to read all of this. There's so much to cover. You can't cover it all, and I can't cover it all. But it's as we read this, it's a reminder that it's the history. It's even though God has been leading the people of Israel for many years, they're still hesitant. They're still wondering. They're still learning who they are and who God is, and it's no different today.